The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you everyone for joining us for another Learning Lunch hosted by Medapproved.com. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Online Training and Education with ForMed Training, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's Learning Lunch will cover security compliance using online resources to meet the HIPAA training and awareness requirements. We're joined today by Mike Semel of Semel Consulting. Mike is one of the top HIPAA experts in the country, and we work closely with him here at Medapproved. You literally could not find a better resource on HIPAA matters, so hold on to your hats and have your questions ready on anything related to HIPAA. Along those lines, please note that you can ask questions of our presenter at any time during today's session by entering them into the chat area during the presentation. In the second half of our session, we will address as many questions as time allows. If we do run out of time, answers to all submitted questions will be posted to our website and sent via email link later in the week. Also, please note that all registered attendees of today's session will receive an email with links to both the recorded and PDF versions of the event. So we often get questions during the presentation if you can get the slideshow, and we'll send that out to you following the event. All right, Mike, thank you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to share your expertise with people.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
All right, well, let's get started then. So what does HIPAA say about training? What does the law tell us?
Well, the law is pretty clear, Brian, and one of the administrative standards for HIPAA is called security awareness and training. They're two different things, and we'll talk about what the differences are. But basically, HIPAA is pretty clear, and it says that a practice or a covered entity, and now business associates, must implement a security awareness and training program for all members of its workforce, including management. That's a quote. So the training program is for all members of the workforce, and the reason that they put including management is to make sure that management in healthcare practices, that would include doctors, understand that they're not exempt from having to take this training. And the training is a really important part of IT security and the protection of protected health information and electronic protected health information that's in EHR systems and in unstructured systems such as Microsoft Word documents, emails, Excel spreadsheets, and those things. Before we go any further, one of the questions that comes up about some of these standards, and this is one of them, is the difference between what's addressable and what's required. And the standard for training or for awareness and training is addressable. The issue becomes, what does addressable mean? It's not optional. Addressable says that if you're not going to do something, you have to come up with a good reason why you aren't doing it and what the alternative is. And as we go through this today, you're going to see, based on the way that HIPAA has been enforced, that there's no question that security awareness and training is really required because of the way that HIPAA is enforced, as opposed to anything that could be considered optional.
And so, Mike, if I can follow up, just to be clear, anyone who comes into contact with protected health information, whether it's a doctor or someone who's a business associate, the law requires them to have adequate training. Is that correct?
That is correct. And also awareness, which are reminders, and we'll talk about those.
All right. So what is the difference then between HIPAA awareness and HIPAA training?
Well, as I've said, awareness includes reminders, and reminders can be handled in many different ways. And the idea of a reminder is that after you train somebody to do something and you show them what the right behavior is, you just want to make sure that you're reminding them every day that they need to follow some of these guidelines. You don't need to go through any sort of specific training class, but reminders can be in different kinds of forms. You could put signs up. You could send messages through computers. You could talk about security in staff meetings. So a reminder is simply a brief message that's reminding someone of the proper behavior. Training is what could be anything from classroom training to online training, and the training will vary by the staff position and the responsibilities. So people in management will have a different training need than the average workforce user.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about awareness. What are some examples of awareness efforts?
Well, you can see from the picture here, this is the zipped lips is a sign that I used to use when I was the CIO in the hospital. And it was actually part of a campaign. And when I got to the hospital, I found that there were passwords in a lot of places. People had shared passwords. Somebody, the first person that showed up in an office in the morning would log in to all the machines. And then that was a courtesy. And then when people showed up, they just walked up to a computer and it was already logged in, so they saved a few seconds. But that's not secure. And HIPAA is very clear that each user must have unique user identification. And then auditing needs to be turned on in the system. And the reason for this is that if there's an incident, someone has to be able to go back through and investigate the incident and find out exactly who was logged in and who accessed the record, or who performed a particular task in the system. So one of the issues that we found was that nurses, I was in a hospital, so nurses were walking around the floors and they had their passwords written on the back of their badges on white tape. And then we found some areas where people had put Post-it notes on their monitors with their login and passwords. And some people may be laughing at this point, but this is the kind of thing you see when you're in a work environment, and it creates some big security risks. So we didn't want to really disrupt things, but we had to fix the problem. So we went to the executives, and at one of the staff meetings, our CEO stood up and said to the department managers, if I ask anybody for their password, anyone in this hospital for their password, and they give it to me, I'm going to terminate their employment. And that was the message, and it was more the message that at the executive level, there was a mandate that people were not to share their passwords. Then we worked with the departments to educate their people to understand that their passwords could not be on the back of their badges, on Post-it notes and whatever. And then we put up these signs. And these signs went in the cafeteria, they went in the elevators and the stairwells, different places where the staff was likely to see them, and very simply said, don't share your password with anyone, even the boss. And that was the message that also to management, they shouldn't be asking for passwords. And in other assessments that I've done, I was working with a company where they had, the managers had the list of all their employees' passwords. And they simply didn't understand that their system could be set up so that the managers had a higher level of access so they could get to everything that the employees were doing without having to know their passwords. So part of this is an education process, but it's also a reminder process. Don't share your password with anyone. The picture at the bottom, it's hard to see, but it's actually a video screen. I was at the U.S. Capitol back in February, and this is in the House of Representatives dining room. And it looks like a sports bar. There's some televisions up with different things going. They're not watching sports, they're watching C-SPAN, and they send these messages across that say, safeguard your flash drive. And the message at the bottom says only use their authorized removable media. So one of the types of data breaches that can occur is that someone can put an infected thumb drive and literally drop it on the floor in the hallway or out in the parking lot. And people in IT security have seen these statistics. Within minutes, someone will pick up that thumb drive and go to their office and plug it in because now they got a free thumb drive, and there could be malicious software on there. So basically, this message is on a video screen. So these are just short messages to remind users to use best practices, and there's nothing more to them or less of them than what you see. It's just a quick message, just a reminder, so that people are doing the right things.
It's an interesting example, the flash drive one, because it's sort of one of those examples of how human nature intersects with technology. So someone finds a flash drive, the first thing they do is go plug it in, and someone who is malicious can obviously use that to then gain access to the system. So I think it's an interesting example.
Right, and one of the big things about IT security is that the statistics are that most incidents are caused by users, and most users are not creating incidents maliciously. In other words, these aren't hackers, or these aren't people that are trying to get even with their boss for not giving them a raise or anything. These are accidents. These are people that, for instance, receive an email from the IRS that says, you didn't pay all your taxes, click here to find out how much you owe, and they click on it and infect the computer and end up with a data breach or a backdoor into their network so that someone can access data and they're not authorized. There's a survey back from 2008, and I know that it's been updated with similar numbers, that said that when businesses were surveyed, most of the respondents said, or actually a third of the respondents said that their employees are the likely source of incidents. So that's why training is so important. You can put in all the technology that you want, all the security, and at some point it's going to get down to a person having to make a decision on what to click on or what to type in that will make the difference between a security breach or avoiding one.
Well, I think that nicely states why awareness programs are so important. So let's talk a little bit then about what are some of the challenges around building that kind of program.
Well, using those last two examples that we showed, the poster and the video screen, they're limited time tools. And in the case of the video screen, there's nothing that you can save in order to prove that you actually had that video on there. The picture is up on the screen for a few seconds and then it goes away. So one of the challenges is, if you're ever audited, how do you prove that that image was on that screen and that anybody saw it? So part of this becomes record keeping. And what you need to be able to do is, in the case of the poster, you could keep a sample, and you could have a calendar that you print out that you store with your records. And with HIPAA and Medicare and some of the other things, you need to keep this stuff for 6 or 7 years to have available in case there's an audit. But what you want to do is be able to document that it occurred. So in the case of the poster, you could keep a copy of it if it's small enough, and store that in a record along with a calendar and even some sort of a statement that you signed that this poster went up for the month of June of 2013. It went up June 1st. It was taken down June 30th, and it was posted in the following locations. So that would be evidence that that poster was up. When it came to the video screen that we saw at the House of Representatives, someone could have taken a picture of it, as I did, and stored the picture, printed out the picture, or even stored it electronically with the same type of information. We used our electronic signage system to send the following messages using the following schedule, and I attest that these were actually produced and displayed for that period of time. So the problem with awareness, and then of course if you just mention something in a staff meeting, you want to document that you did that. So it's not a lot, but you have to think like an auditor, and you have to think like you're doing these things not just to do the right thing, that's the ultimate reason, but you also need to be able to document it and prove it so that if you're audited, you've got evidence that shows that you were compliant.
So from the perspective of an audit, you need to be able to show that documentation, or there's no real way to prove that you've actually done these efforts. So let's switch over then to talk a little bit about training. What is HIPAA training?
Well, let's talk about training. Training is some sort of a class or a tool that's used, could be written, where you're trying to convey to someone knowledge or behavior. So you're either trying to teach them information and they'll know something when they get done with that, or you're trying to teach them behavior so that you're showing them what to do, or in some cases what not to do, so that after the class, they're going to do follow the guidelines of your organization in terms of how they act and how they do their jobs. So training is just a wide open field, and it can be created internally. You can purchase it. The staff can take classes in-house, online, remotely. We're in an internet-based world, so as we're doing right now with this webinar, you could consider this training. It's a lunch and learn, where we're conveying both knowledge and behavior using an internet tool to communicate. And people have dialed in, but they'll also be able to come back and access this later through a website so that they can review it themselves if they miss something or want to hear it again, or they can share it with others.
So even documenting something like attending this webinar is a good way to show HIPAA training and awareness. Obviously, this isn't all the training that someone would need, but it does count in that overall picture. Is that correct?
Absolutely. For all the people on this, if you could even write an email to yourself or send it to your HR department, depending on the size of your organization, or if you keep a file on training for employees, just create a quick document that says that today you attended this webinar, here's what the topic was, here's when it started, here's when it ended, and keep track of that in terms of how much effort you're spending to keep up with the information as it becomes available.
Okay, so we talked about challenges around awareness. What are some challenges with training a workforce on HIPAA?
Well, the challenges with training are a lot greater than the challenges with awareness. And the reason for that is with awareness, you can create 10 posters, put them around the building, and you're handled your entire workforce or your entire awareness program in that amount of time and effort. The problem with training is that you have to cover everybody. Go back to that basic rule that says your entire workforce, including management, must receive training. So how do you schedule people? Depending on the size of your organization, are people working multiple shifts? You have people working remotely. Some organizations, people work from home or from a remote office, and they're wearing multiple hats, so they're busy all the time. You've got different operating hours. You run multiple shifts. And then you have different classes of employees. And in the way that I characterize training is that there are some employees that need to have knowledge. In other words, knowledge of HIPAA and enforcement and reporting regulations and how security incidents need to be managed. And then you have some people that are more at the workforce level that simply need to understand these are things I should do and these are things I shouldn't do. So you have different roles and different responsibilities, and that affects what training people get. Of course, you couldn't talk about training or anything that comes in contact with your workforce or deals with compliance without talking about cost. So what you're trying to do, what everyone's trying to do, is maximize the value for the investment. And in the case of training, you don't need to have a workforce member who simply needs to understand that they don't share their password and they shouldn't send patient data through email to organizations outside theirs. They shouldn't send patient data through text messages, etc. They don't need to have a full HIPAA knowledge course. So their training can be a lot less expensive than a HIPAA knowledge course, which would be appropriate for a manager. And then we're looking at consistency in a couple of ways. One of them is that you want to make sure that everybody is trained. And even though HIPAA doesn't go into the specifics of how to train people or even how often to train people, we can look at some of the guidance that's come out and also some of the enforcement activities where people have received very large fines. And training is mentioned in those enforcement resolution agreements. And there's some guidance there that can help people understand how often to do it. But when you think about this, you need to cover your entire workforce, which includes your current employees. You have to train all new employees before you give them access to any patient information. That's a HIPAA requirement. And then, as we said before in the awareness program and talking about training, how do you document it? How do you document the fact that a person has received the training, both the date and the time, and what the training was, and keep that maintained for your workforce and also for your current workforce and also for new employees that come to work for you. And there was an audit by CMS, which is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and one of the things that they noted was that covered entities did not track and retain evidence of training completion, and they said that the covered entities had a formal or informal process in place requiring employees to take security awareness training either prior to receipt of the system access for new hires or at least annually for existing employees. However, the covered entities could not prove evidence that every employee completed the training within the required time frame. So from an auditing standpoint, it didn't happen. And these are the issues that I think are frustrating, is that when you actually do go through the effort to put together the training and make sure that people are scheduled and they take the training, that it's like hitting a golf ball or a baseball, that the club or the bat doesn't stop when it hits the ball. There's a follow-through, and the follow-through for training is to make sure that it's properly documented.
Yeah, that's a theme that's throughout this presentation, is that everything you do around HIPAA compliance, you need to document that in case there ever were a breach, or if you were ever audited, you need to be able to show those steps you've taken. So is there a standard HIPAA course that's applicable to everyone in a medical or business associate workforce? Has the government provided a course that people can take?
No, the answer to both those questions is no. So there's no government course. The government does not provide training. The government, when it comes to HIPAA, provides very little information in the HIPAA laws, but there is guidance that they do provide, and they also enforce the law, and you can go into the enforcements and kind of look backwards in the sense of, even though they didn't say in the HIPAA regulation how often people should be trained, when you look at this guidance, for instance, that I was just reading, it says that you have to train people prior to the receipt of system access for new hires, or at least annually for existing employees. So that's not specific in the HIPAA law itself, but in their guidance that accompanies it. That's what they're looking for. And then when we go to enforcement, we see that they have actually, in some of the violations, they've talked about organizations that have not trained workforce members, that the covered entity did not provide and document training of each workforce member. And in one case, the violation said it was from April 14th, 2003 to October 21st, 2009, when an incident took place. So that was an issue that rose to the level of what HIPAA calls willful neglect, or the Office for Civil Rights and Enforces HIPAA calls willful neglect. That means that you knew that HIPAA, you had to comply with HIPAA, and you simply didn't follow the rules, and that's where the big fines come from. So when it comes to the courses themselves, what you need to have is a higher level training for security officers and managers, and then a lower level training class for the workforce. And I think the way that I would distinguish this is that people that are responsible for what the practice does, or what the organization does, in other words, management people, they need to understand what the laws are, some of the specific rules, what the practice should be doing. If there's an incident, that it should be investigated. If it is determined to have been a data breach, how it needs to be reported. So anybody that's responsible for the organizational behavior and what the organization needs to do needs to have high-level training. For your workforce members, where they only need to know what they need to do and what they need to not do, then the workforce training focuses more on behavior. Don't send patient data through text messages. And the reason I bring that up is that I talked to medical practices that have taken the workforce training and have done it for their staff, and the practice manager or the person that's in charge of compliance will come back to me and say, oh, you know, as soon as people saw that they shouldn't send text messages, we had a discussion here because we needed to educate our answering service and some of the receptionists and the staff people that communicate with our practitioners to make sure that they don't do that. And that's exactly why this training needs to take place, is to make sure that the people at the workforce level understand what they should and shouldn't do.
And the problem with text messages, just in case anyone's wondering, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Mike, is for one thing, they're not encrypted in any way, so they're not a secure form of communication, and there's also no way to delete them. Maybe you could tell us just a little bit more about that.
Sure. And the first thing I'll tell you is that when I talk about text messaging, I'm talking about the text messaging services that are available through the wireless carriers. So Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, all of those companies. And as Brian said, they're not secure. When you think you've deleted a message, it's still out on their system. And there was even news today I saw this morning that goes back to that hacking scandal with the press in England. And the newspapers over there, this is the Rupert Murdoch scandal, the newspapers were accused of hacking into the text messaging systems for celebrities and political people, and they were able to do it. And recently, I think it was the mayor of Detroit was caught a couple of years ago doing something he shouldn't have done, and there was a whole string of text messages, and there have been other politicians in some of these scandals where their text messages came out, and these people thought that they had deleted them. So text messaging is not a secure method. It can be hacked, and the messages are not deleted. They're stored on a system, and if you want to get into some more HIPAA requirements, the people that maintain the data, in other words, the carriers whose servers these messages end up on, they're not your HIPAA business associates, and they won't sign business associate agreements to protect the data. So any data that's sent through a text message that's stored up on one of the carriers like AT&T or Verizon's servers, that becomes a data breach in and of itself, that you're sending the message to, or you're sending patient data to someone that's not authorized to access it. So that's the reason that we want to teach people these things. And this is exactly the behavioral stuff that we're talking about. So when it comes to our training, the example we just discussed would be something where the medical practice manager or the security officer would understand things about that the carriers for wireless telephones or cell phones are not business associates. They need to understand what a business associate is and all that stuff. So that's the knowledge training that's required. But then the workforce training is simply don't do it. Don't send the messages that way. And if you see one, alert your management to have the practice or have the that type of behavior stopped.
So how should HIPAA training be delivered in your expert opinion?
Well, it kind of varies. And if you're a very, very small practice, if you only have 2 or 3 employees, you could get everybody to lunch together and do a lunch and learn yourself. And if you can reach out and touch everybody in your practice, then it's fairly easy for you to accomplish the training, document it, and be done with it. The problem is that most practices and healthcare organizations, we take into account hospitals, medical centers, clinics, surgery centers, and now with business associates, you have, and back into the covered entities, you also have the payers. So you have the insurance companies and the self-funded businesses that they'll pay premiums for health insurance, but they self-fund their insurance. So these organizations are typically larger, and in the case of medical centers and hospitals, they're going to run 7 by 24, so you've got multiple shifts. You've got your full-time staff, and one of the challenges that we had working at the hospital was that we had per diem nurses, people that were nurses that worked between several different hospitals, almost like substitute teachers. So if someone called in sick, they would come in and cover, or if someone was out on maternity leave, they would come in and cover for a period of time. And we had to make sure that every single one of those people had received training before we gave them authorization to access our system. So it becomes a huge challenge, and the simple answer is that online training is the only way that I know of where you can make sure that people receive the training, both your current staff and new employees as they're being hired, and also to be able to build in the capability to document it, to go back and prove that they took the training, and in the event of an audit, to be able to print out reports and show that your entire workforce is trained. You can also track the schedules of people. So if you say that people need to be trained within the next 30 days, you can print out a report of who's been trained and see who hasn't and keep working on them. So it helps you manage. The other thing is that it's self-paced. So we run into different situations. We'll have some people that will be able to do the work during their working hours, and time can be allocated to go and take the training. Other people may have to do it at home or at night or on a weekend, and they can start the process, and then if they're interrupted, they can kind of press the hold button and come back to it later. Some of the groups that we work with, for instance, pharmacies, the pharmacists may not be busy for a while, so they can start the training, and then when customers come in or when prescriptions are faxed in or called in and they have to work, they can again kind of press the hold button, go do the work, and then come back to the training. So it's self-paced. The other thing is this training today, as we're doing it, is both visual. We have the slides on, and we also are talking about it. So some people can learn simply by reading. There are people that can't learn simply by reading. So training can be a combination of slides, as we're showing here, but also an explanation of someone talking and reading the slides, or providing the information that's on the slides, so that it's an enhanced way of learning compared to simply saying, here's a slide presentation, go through this and then go take the test. So it accommodates the different learning styles. As the work is completed, even on a per module basis, not even the entire course, you can track where people are in their training, and then the system inherently keeps the training records. So you can have all of your training records in one place so that you can access them quickly and not have to go and talk to the HR department about, where's the record for this person's HIPAA training or whatever. So it makes it very, very simple, and it's completely consistent and on demand. Everybody receives the same training, and then they can do it whenever they need to accommodate your schedule. There may be union requirements. There may be overtime issues that you have to be careful of. So you can manage everything through an online system.
So what classes does Medapproved offer for HIPAA training? And tell us a little bit about the program that we've developed with you, Mike.
Okay, so CHSP is not spelled out here, but it's Certified HIPAA Security Professional. And that's the training that's appropriate for managers, business associates, again, the people that have to have knowledge of what HIPAA is and understand the rules, how to investigate incidents, how to report data breaches, and understand how the business is supposed to operate. So again, the business could be a clinic, it could be a small practice, could be a hospital, or it could, in the case of a business associate, even be a law office or an IT company or a shredding company. Anybody that comes in contact with patient data, a business associate is a company that comes in contact with patient data, but they're not a covered entity, which would be a provider or a payer. So we came up with a course that really goes through 10 different modules that explains what HIPAA is and where it came from. So there's some background. It also talks about the specific rules, the privacy rule. The privacy rule came out first back in 2003, and the privacy rule is the rule that governs all protected data, whether it's verbal, people simply talking, whether it's written. Back in 2003, most patient records were written documents, paper records, and then electronic. So electronic used to mean something that was just in an electronic file. Now we have full electronic health record systems, but since 2005, when the security rule came out, there have been a lot of changes in the way that healthcare operates because of the changes in technology. So now we have verbal talking about patients in systems that used to be on tape. So back in the early days, a doctor would examine a patient, go into a dictation room, record the information about the patient visit, and give orders or order tests, provide some diagnostic information, whatever, and then a transcriptionist would take the tape, physically take the tape, put it into a transcription device, and usually had a foot pedal to move things forward and backwards, and type up what the doctor said. Now all of that's done with computer files. So doctors are carrying what look like little tape recorders, but they're really computers. They're recording onto a voice chip, memory chip. They're recording a voice file, and in some cases there's no person translating that anymore. There are automatic dictation systems. In other cases, there are transcriptionists who take that file that may be sent to them across the office, or in some cases across the world, and they're typing it in and then sending the file back. So now we have all these verbal systems where the data is protected. And the other thing that's changed is both with voicemail and faxing, where we have what they call unified communications. So a voicemail message may come in, and instead of being on the old type of answering machine, it's now going to be converted to an email and sent to someone. And that becomes pretty risky, because if it's patient information, whether it's the patient themselves calling, or if it's a consult, the doctor's office calling another doctor to offer a consult on a patient, they're going to list the patient's name and what the diagnosis is, or some information about treatment. So even those things have all converted. It's important that all the managers understand where the protected data is and how to manage it. So that's what the management training is. The CHSP training not only gives you the training, but when you pass the final test, you are certified through Medapproved as a certified HIPAA security professional, and you can actually put those initials after your name, or put the certification after your name as you're signing documents or having business cards printed. If you're a healthcare professional, that also can qualify for continuing education units. So when you take this course, not only are you being compliant with HIPAA, but you're also being compliant with your requirements to continue your education. The workforce training is really a streamlined course, shorter, simpler. There's no certification. It basically just tracks that the user took the course and passed it. And what that training does is teach behavior. It teaches some of the things we've been talking about. Don't send text messages with patient information, and don't share passwords, things like that. And there are also some examples for people to look at, and those include things like, this is what a phishing, P-H-I-S-H-I-N-G, email looks like. And a phishing email is the kind that's trying to hook you into doing something so that someone can gain unauthorized access to your system. So that would be the IRS email. One of the examples that we put in the training is a message I received saying that I had to pay my Sprint wireless cell phone bill for $2,600, and I should click on this link to pay the bill. And I looked at it and didn't understand why I'd gotten it, because I don't use Sprint. And then when we checked out the links that were in the document, we found out they went to Mexico. So that was an email that was used for pure stealing. Have another client that got the email supposedly from the IRS, saying she hadn't paid her taxes. Click here to find out how much you owed. And she did that, and that got really ugly. That opened a link into their bank accounts, so that when she logged into the bank account to transfer money, someone else was able to piggyback on her access, and they came within 2 mouse clicks of losing $209,000 that someone had tried to transfer, and she was able to catch it before that happened. But those are the kinds of things that we're trying to show people as some examples of what to look for, so that you don't do something that's stupid. And also we educate them on what's appropriate and what's not appropriate and what the sanctions are. So we don't know the particular sanction policies for any medical practice or healthcare organization, but we can tell them that a criminal offense would be to sell a patient's record for personal gain, or to give the patient's record away to harm someone. So it's not appropriate, as happened a few years ago in Las Vegas, where someone at a medical center was selling car accident victims' patient records to personal injury attorneys. So those are the types of things that we're explaining to the workforce. These are things you should do. Keep your password private. Don't write it down and post it on your monitor, etc. And these are things you shouldn't do. So those are the differences between the management and the certification training.
So I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. I'm going to provide additional information about the training that's available to our attendees at the end of our presentation. And feel free to ask questions about the training now if you have any. But I want to save time for questions because it's a rare opportunity to get to ask Mike questions about HIPAA. So we have some in already that I'll share with you, Mike, but I'd encourage our guests to go ahead and keep the questions coming. So let's start with the first question.
Okay.
First of all, I should address this very quickly. Someone asked whether HIPAA applies to medical staff at hospitals, and of course it does. So whether someone's at a clinic or a hospital makes no difference in terms of HIPAA. But here's a question I want you to address, Mike. If you're not supposed to note your passwords, what is your recommendation for securely storing a password so you don't forget it?
Well, Brian, it's a great question. And before I even get into the answer to that one, let me just say that sometimes we receive questions through these that require some research. And I once described this type of session as stump the chump. It's kind of hard sometimes to answer questions right off the top of your head. But I'll do my best, and if there is anything where I do want to look it up or I want to reserve some time to think about it, I'll tell you, and then we'll send the answers out, or the questions and answers out to everybody.
That's a great point, Mike.
To answer your question about how to remember passwords, it's a difficult thing to do, first of all, because I think each of us has a lot of passwords that we have to remember. And in some cases, you want to balance something that you can remember versus something that's easy for someone else to figure out. And then you have to comply with the password rules in your organization. So password rules could be that your organization might require a strong password. And a strong password might mean something like, and this can vary based on the system, it needs to be at least 8 characters long, include an uppercase and lowercase letter and a number, or a special character like the pound sign or an exclamation point. And then organizations will put rules in that say your password has to be changed every, and then there'll be some number of days or months. The challenge on how often passwords have to be changed, which relates to this question, is that if you do it too often, I've seen systems that require passwords to be changed every 30 days. It makes it difficult for people to remember things. Just about the time they remember their password, and they don't have to think about it or go look it up someplace, then it has to be changed. So I think the answer to the question is a couple things. One is come up with a password scheme that you can remember. So that could be, for instance, somebody's name, and I'll use my name, and Mike, M-I-K-E. So one of the things you could do is you could take a name and you could change things like letters into numbers. So it could be the letter M, capital letter M, and then the number 1, and then a lowercase k, and then a number 3. So that would remind me that it's Mike, and I would simply know that the I is a 1 and the E is a 3, and then I could put some numbers after it. Now, you want to be careful because in this day and age where there's a lot of personal information floating around the internet, if you took something like your birth date and use that as your numbers, that's going to be pretty easy to hack. If you use any word, what we call a dictionary word, a word you can find in the dictionary, that could be easy to hack. One of the things that is available in most systems, and the systems that are set up well, will only allow a certain number of attempts before you're locked out of the system, and then you have to do a password reset or call the help desk to unlock you. And that's so that people can't use these automatic programs that will take every word in the dictionary and see if that's your password. If you have a cat or a dog and you put your pet's name out on Facebook, then it may be easy for somebody to look you up, find out some personal information about you, and try some of these different things if they're trying to hack in as you. So there are different answers to the question about how you can keep the password. One thing you can do is make it easy enough to remember. That's really the best way, so that it's what you know and it's not written down anywhere. If you don't remember it, you could put it, for instance, in a wallet or something, and as long as it's not clear what it is, I mean, I kind of camouflage it a little bit, but if you had to have your password someplace, you could put it someplace that's secure so you can get to it, even though you want to make sure that other people don't know where it is, and in some cases, if someone found it, what it was for, what the information was. And then there are also some secure systems that store passwords. And I'm not going to name names because there are a bunch of these, and in hospitals, they'll use something like a single sign-on system where if you have to remember multiple passwords to get into multiple systems, one password to get into the EHR system, another password to get into some other system, they'll have what they call a single sign-on tool where you basically have one master password, and once you're authenticated, then you're into the system and it automatically takes you to the other places. There's also multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication includes what you know, which would be your password, but also what you have. And what you have is kind of who you are, like a fingerprint. Or in some cases, you may have seen people that have these little number fobs. They look like a key ring type thing, but they have code numbers on them, where when you enter your name and your password, you then have to enter this temporary code number to get access to the system. So that's the type of system where your password, even if you lost it, would not allow somebody to gain access, because they also have to have your code number, which is a limited time thing. It's a very secure type of system. So the best answer on how to protect the password is to make it something that you can remember. The IT departments and the management of practices and healthcare organizations need to balance the need to change passwords, because if someone does lose it, you don't want to have people with long-term access into your system. That's why you want people to change their passwords. But you need to balance that with the risk that people are then going to come up with ways to hide them or write them down someplace so that they can get to it, because they password to be changed every 30 days or so.
And I want to mention that in the workforce training, there's guidance on what is a sound password and what is not a very secure password. But we're getting quite a few questions here, so I want to move along and remind our attendees that if we happen not to get to your question because of our limited time, we will follow up with written answers. But we'll get to as many as we can here. I want to ask a question from one of our attendees about temps. The person asked, what should be done if you have interns or short-term staff in your office in terms of their HIPAA training? Do they also need HIPAA training?
The answer is yes, they need HIPAA training. And when you talk about staff and temps, I've mentioned per diem nurses earlier who are part-timers that come in. And in some cases, the people, if you're walking down the halls in a hospital and you see people that look like they're working there, I mean, nurses and aides and things like that, you may not realize that they actually aren't all employees of the same organization. So, for example, when I was the CIO in the hospital, we had outsourced our emergency room physicians to a service. So the service sent different doctors in on weekends and evenings and things, and we had to give them all access to the system, but they were not employees of our organization. They were employees of the service that provided that, or the company that provided that service to us. So when you're getting people trained or when you're working with your workforce, if they're not your employees, number one, you either have a choice, or you have a choice of either treating them as workforce employees or having the company that they work with be a business associate and making sure that they're responsible for the training and that those people are trained. So you have to make the decision if you're working with an agency, are we going to train people and are we going to handle it and put them into our system, or before we give them access to any patient data, are we going to require that organization to prove that that person's been trained because they're a business associate providing us for those people. But when it comes to interns and part-timers, anybody that's in your office that's going to have any access to any patient data, and keep in mind that if they're in a position, in a physical place in your office where they can hear conversations about patients, people on the phone calling other practices to schedule a consult, or someone calling in a prescription, that's protected information. So anybody that's in a place in the office that could hear that needs to have HIPAA training and understand what they can and cannot do with that information. So the answer is that it doesn't matter whether it's whether they're full or part-time, doesn't matter whether they're employed by your organization or someone else. If they're in your office or if they're in your organization and they have any sort of access to patient information, they must have training.
We have a lot of questions about business associates, and we always do. I think that's an area that people have a lot of concerns, and there's some confusion around it. So let me ask one of these questions. A covered entity is having problems convincing a data center where they have equipment in the location, it's a location with more than one client in the facility, that they need to sign a business associate agreement. The data center says, quote, we don't have access to your equipment, so it's not necessary. Can you address that issue? And if they do need to be business associates, what's a good strategy for getting them to recognize their obligations under the law?
Well, those are two different questions, Brian. I can tell you exactly where to look to find the proof, but to get them to commit to it can be a different issue. And the area of business associates changed in January when the final rule came out. The HIPAA Omnibus final rule was announced January 17th. And what changed in here were a couple of things. One was that, first of all, we knew this was coming. All business associates have to comply with HIPAA just like covered entities. So if you're a medical practice, you had to comply starting in 2003, and you were directly liable for any data breaches or any information breaches of protected health information. Business associates were not directly liable, so the new rule says that they have to sign business associate agreements, and there's a new agreement, new information to put in those agreements that was also announced in January. You need to catch up on that if you haven't. The second thing is that the business associates have to sign those agreements and implement full HIPAA compliance, including policies, procedures, workforce training, and documenting that their services they're delivering are HIPAA compliant. So the specific question about data centers is that, again, the world's changed. We talked about some of the changes earlier where voice messages are now converted to emails and things. Well, HIPAA recognized, or the people that enforce HIPAA and that write these rules recognized that, number one, the data is not always stored with the organization that's the business associate. Business associates will contract with, say, an online backup company or a data center to store the data. So this new rule very, very clearly says that an organization that maintains data, maintains is the new buzzword, even if they don't look at it. If they don't look at it, they still have to comply as a business associate. Many of these organizations are in denial. They don't know, they don't believe they should have to do this. They claim that the information is encrypted or it's in locked cabinets, or in the case of paper records, it's in file boxes that are sealed and they don't open them, so they don't think they have to comply. There was a 562-page rule, the HIPAA omnibus rule, final rule that came out was 562 pages. And somewhere around page 25, I think it was pages 24 to 26 or 25 to 27, is the area where this is talked about. And the reason that I know it so well is that I work with companies that own data centers and online backup providers and things like that. And we've tried to educate them, and part of this is getting them past their denial. They argue they shouldn't have to do this. Well, this isn't a question that's optional. HIPAA is very clear on this. Back in January, people said, well, they're going to change that rule. Well, the rule kicks into effect on September 23rd, and there's not been any word from the federal government that they're about to change this. And one of the things that I recently told the CEO of a data center was they call it the final rule for a reason. This is the final rule that they're coming out with, and it's very, very clear. One of the things that we hear from data centers is, well, we're SOC 2 compliant, or we've had these SAS 70 or SSAE 16 audits, totally different from HIPAA compliance. And I can send some guidance out. Brian will do this for the people that are on the call, where they can look to get the specific information about data centers and companies that store records even though they don't access them. And also some references to, I found something in one of the data center magazines that talks about this. So even in their own industry, they should be aware of it.
So we may have time for just one quick question before we need to wrap up. So let's try to keep this one brief if we could. And then again, to all of our attendees, we're going to send out written responses to the questions that we've addressed and the ones we didn't get to. So is it okay to ask a business associate to provide proof that they've completed HIPAA training?
Absolutely. And the reason for this is that even though the new rule says that business associates must comply with HIPAA and that they're also liable, the medical practices that I use the term invited them to the party, in other words, that contracted with them to provide a service that gives them access to patient data, it's still the medical practice's responsibility, primary responsibility to protect that information. So if there is a data breach from a business associate, and the reporting shows that 20 to 30% of data breaches since 2009 were by business associates, and the covered entities, their clients, paid the fines and paid the penalties. So the fact that business associates are now required to comply does not mean that a practice has any less responsibility. In fact, it has more, because now you have these data centers and other subcontractors. So it's not just proof that the business associate's compliant. You have to be able to get proof that all of their subcontractors are also compliant.
All right. Well, we're nearly out of time. Thank you for answering those questions, Mike. And I want to remind one more time our audience members that we're going to assemble those questions and post answers on our site with links delivered via email later in the week. Thank you, Mike, for joining us for today's Learning Lunch.
Thank you, Brian.
To learn more about our industry expert Mike Semel and Semel Consulting, please visit www.semelconsulting.com. You can see the address there on your screen. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees. Remember that all registered attendees will receive an email with links to both recorded and PDF versions of this session. So those of you who have asked about slides, watch your email boxes for those. Visit formedtraining.com/courses.html to learn more about Medapproved's education and training programs. If you select the HIPAA training category, you can learn more about the CHSP course that Mike discussed and register for the course there. It's a fully automated system, so it'll take you through and get you signed up for the learning system right there. You can select the category HIPAA training bundles to learn more about workforce training. If you have any questions about any of this, you can contact me, your moderator, Brian Johnson, at b.johnson@formeddapproved.com. We're also pleased to announce the launch of a new suite of products at Medapproved called HIPAA Secure. If your practice has never had a HIPAA risk analysis, HIPAA Secure offers a total solution with documentation, training, meaningful use analysis, and network vulnerability analysis. You can select just the services you need or select one of the value bundles. Visit formedapproved.com/education/HIPAA_secure.html to learn more about that program, and you can see the URL there on your screen. Visit formedapproved.com to learn more about our upcoming Learning Lunches. The Learning Lunch button will take you to our entire slate of upcoming webinars. You can register right there. Our next Learning Lunch will air on June 11th, and we'll cover the subject of revenue growth, improving practices for better medical billing. Keep an eye on your email box and our homepage for other upcoming topics, and thank you again for joining us today.